Hi, greetings. It's me, Dr. Paul Gerhardt, and this is the 11th video in the Essentials of Negotiation series. This particular video is going to be on international and cross-cultural negotiation. So let's get started. Let's talk about what makes an international negotiation different. Well, there are two contexts with an influence on international negotiations. The environmental context, including environmental forces that neither negotiator controls that influence the negotiation. And then the immediate context includes factors which negotiators appear to have some control. Understanding factors in both contexts is important to understanding the complexity of international negotiation processes and, of course, outcomes. So, firms conducting business in different countries are working with different legal and political systems. There may be implications for for taxes that an organization pays, legal codes or standards that it must meet, and different codes of contract law, standards of enforcement, and political considerations which may enhance or detract from the conduct of business negotiation in various uh, countries and at various times. Let's talk a little bit about international economics from an environmental context. The exchange value of international currencies naturally fluctuate, and this factor must be considered when negotiating different things in different countries. The risk is typically greater for the party who must pay in the other country's currency. The less stable the currency, the greater the risk for both parties. Any change in value of a currency, upward or downward, can significantly affect the value of the deals for both parties. Foreign governments and bureaucracies may have a bearing on the negotiation process. Countries differ in the extent in which government regulates industries and organizations. Firms in the US are relatively free from government intervention, although some industries are more heavily regulated than others, like the power generation or defense, for example. And some states have tougher environmental regulations than others. In general, business negotiations in the US occur without government approval. Parties decide whether to engage in an agreement based on the business reasons alone, and in contrast, governments of many countries supervise imports and joint ventures. Political considerations influence negotiations more heavily than legitimate business reasons. So let's talk about the environmental context as it relates to instability. So most of us would agree that North America is relatively stable, but instability takes many different forms. A lack of resources that Americans commonly expect during business negotiations, paper, electricity, computers, shortages of other goods and services like food, reliable transportation, potable water, political instability, coups, sudden shifts in government policy, major currency reevaluation. Negotiators facing unstable circumstances should include clauses in their contracts allowing for easy cancellation of neutral arbitration and consider purchasing insurance to guarantee contract provisions. Let's talk about environmental context with some general ideology. Negotiators in the US generally share a common ideology about the benefits of individualism and capitalism and believe in the following: individual rights, superiority of private investment, and the importance of making a profit in business, right? Negotiators from other countries may not share this ideology. Negotiators from China or France may stress group rights over individual rights. They may stress public investment over private investment, and they may have different views on earning and sharing profit. Ideology clash increase communication and challenges in negotiations. As far as culture is concerned, culture's critical role will be discussed in a little bit. But here are some of the key highlights. People from different cultures appear to negotiate differently. Different cultures may interpret the negotiation processes differently. People in some cultures approach negotiations deductively, whereas people from other countries are more inductive. In some cultures, parties negotiate substantive issues while considering the relationship to be more or less incidental. In other countries, the relationship is the main focus of the negotiation, and the issues are more or less incidental. The preference for conflict resolution varies across cultures. External stakeholders. Now, external stakeholders are the various people that the organization may have that have an interest or stake in the outcomes of the negotiations. They're business associations, labor unions, embassies, industry association, just to name a few. So let's talk about some immediate context now. Relative bargaining power. Joint ventures have been studied, and relative power has been viewed as the amount of equity each side is willing to invest in the new venture, presuming the party who invests more equity has more power and more influence on the negotiation process and outcome. Some research suggests that relative power appears to be due to management control of the project heavily influenced by negotiating. Several factors influence relative power: success access or special access to markets, distribution systems, and management of government relations. So, in the immediate context, let's talk about levels of conflict. The level of conflict and type of interdependence between the parties will influence the negotiation process and outcome. High conflict situations or conflicts that are ethnically, identity, or geographically based will be more difficult to resolve. Also, important is the extent to which negotiators frame the negotiation differently or conceptualize what the negotiation concerns. This varies across cultures. How negotiators respond to conflict also varies by culture. Diplomatic back channel negotiations conducted in secret may help resolve the high conflict situations, but success is not guaranteed. Also, in the immediate context, we have to consider relationships and desired outcomes. The relationships among principal negotiators before negotiations impact the negotiation process and outcome. Negotiators are part of the large relationship between parties. The history between those parties influences current negotiations, as we talked about before, just as the current negotiation will influence any future negotiations. Desired outcomes. Tangible and intangible factors play a large role in determining the outcomes of international negotiations. Countries often use international negotiations to achieve both domestic and international political goals. Ongoing tension can exist between the parties' short term objectives for current negotiations and its influence on their long term relations. In the immediate context, we have to think about the immediate stakeholders. The immediate stakeholders in the negotiation include the negotiators themselves, as well as the people they directly represent, such as managers, employers, boards of directors. Stakeholders can influence negotiators in many ways. Negotiator skills, abilities, and experience can impact the process and outcome of international negotiations. Personal motivations of the principal negotiators and other immediate stakeholders can influence the negotiation process and outcomes. So let's conceptualize the culture and negotiation. There are many different meanings of the concept of culture, but all definitions share two important aspects. First, culture is a group level phenomenon. That means that a defined group of people share beliefs, values, and behavioral expectations. Second, cultural beliefs, values, and behavioral expectations are learned and passed on to new members of the group. Culture can be conceptualized in international negotiation in four ways: as a learned behavior, as shared values, dialectic, and of course, in context. Culture really is kind of a learned behavior, and we need to understand that. This approach concentrates on creating a catalog of behaviors that the foreign negotiators should expect when entering a host culture. Many books and articles provide lists of do's and don'ts. For instance, Chinese negotiators begin negotiation with a search for broad principles and building a relationship. This is followed by assessment boundaries of the relationship. A decision about an agreement will eventually be made and form the foundation for further concessions and modifications. Culture can have shared values, and Hofstede put together a model of cultural dimensions that help us understand this a little bit better. So there's individualism versus collectivism, and that's short-term criteria versus long-term relationships. There's power distance, that's low power distance distributes decision making, while high power distance seeks approval from those higher up. Masculinity or femininity, competitors versus empathy. Uncertainty avoidance. Low uncertainty avoiders adapt to change, others adapt less so. A drawback of this model is that all studied participants came from one company, were mostly male, and highly educated. So, culture as a dialectic. A dialectic is a tension illustrated by two common parables: too many cooks spoil the broth, and two heads are better than one. This approach reminds you that not every person from the same culture share the same values. It does not provide simple advice for behaving in a negotiation. Recent work examines negotiation metaphors. In the US, negotiation is a sport. In Japan, negotiation is, is a tradition. The greater the difference in cultural negotiation metaphors, the more likely there will be misunderstanding and less profitable outcomes. Negotiators with a stronger understanding of the negotiation metaphor within the culture are more likely to succeed in negotiations. Let's talk about culture in context. Proponents of this approach recognize human behavior is not determined by a single cause. All behavior may be understood at many levels simultaneously. Negotiation is determined by many factors, one of which is culture. The cultural complexity theory suggests that cultural values have a direct effect on negotiation at times and moderate effect at other times. France has both monarchical and democratic traditions, both of which can influence negotiation behavior depending on the context. One group of researchers noted that unwieldy number of constructs used to explore cross-cultural differences in negotiation. They proposed a model that integrates negotiation strategy, trust, cultural tightness, looseness, and mindset, holistic versus analytical. Their model is an excellent example of studying culture in context. Let's talk about managerial perspectives, and we'll define it and talk about the opportunity here. The fundamental definition of negotiation, what is negotiation and what occurs when we negotiate when we differ greatly across cultures. Americans tend to view negotiation as a competitive process of offers and counteroffers, while the Japanese tend to view the negotiation as an opportunity for information sharing. Culture influences the way negotiators perceive an opportunity as distributive versus integrated. Negotiators in North America are predisposed to perceive negotiation as distributive. This is not the case outside North America. Some managerial perspectives about selection and protocol. Criteria used to select who will participate differs across cultures and can include the following: knowledge of the subject matter being negotiated, seniority of even family connections, gender, age, experience, or status. Different cultures weigh the criteria to select negotiators differently. Cultures differ in the degree to which protocol or the formality of the relations between two negotiating parties is important. American culture is important in the least formal in the world. Uh, Familiar communication, first names are used, titles are ignored. Informal countries, not using proper titles are considered rude. Business cards are important in the Pacific Rim countries, and they have their own protocol for presenting the cards. Managerial perspectives, communication, and time sensitivity. Cultures influence how people communicate, verbally and nonverbally. Differences in body language across cultures may make some behavior highly insulting in one culture and innocuous in another. Placing your feet on the desk in the US signals power, while in Thailand it's considered very insulting. To avoid offending the international negotiator, you have to be able to observe cultural rules and communication clearly. Culture determines what time means and how it affects negotiation. In the US, people respect time by being on time, being sensitive to not wasting time, and believing that faster is better than slower. While in other cultures, they have a different view of time, especially in hot climates. Arab speaking cultures focus on event time than a clock time. In China and Latin America, time is unimportant and negotiation focus on task no matter how much time that it takes. Now let's shift gears and talk about risk propensity in groups versus individuals. Cultures vary in the content to which they are willing to take risks. Negotiators in risk oriented cultures will be more willing to move early on a deal and will generate more chances. They'll take more chances. Those in risk avoiding cultures are more likely to seek further information and take a wait and see stance. Americans fall on risk-taking end of the continuum, as do some Asian cultures, while some European cultures are pretty much conservative. Cultures differ over whether they emphasize the individual or the group. The United States is very much an individual-oriented culture, where being independent and assertive are valued and praised. Group-oriented cultures, in contrast, favor superiority of group and see individual needs as second to the group's needs. Group oriented cultures value fitting in and rewarding team players. Here, let's talk about the nature of agreements and emotionalism. Culture has been an important effect on both concluding agreements and on what form the negotiated agreements take. In the US, agreements are typically based on logic, are often formalized and forced through the legal system. In other cultures, obtaining the deal may be based on who you are rather than what you can do. Cultures may influence the content to which negotiators display emotions. Emotions may be used as tactics, as they may be a natural response to a positive or negative circumstance during the negotiation, while personality likely plays a role in the expression of emotions. There also appears to be considerable cultural differences. The rules that govern general emotional displays in a culture are likely to be present during the negotiation. Influence of culture on negotiations. Let's talk about the research and perspectives. The last 20 years has seen an increase in research on cross-cultural negotiation and has studied the following topics: influence of culture in negotiation outcomes, negotiation process and information exchange, negotiator cognition, negotiator ethics and tactics, and finally conflict resolution. There are effects of culture on negotiation outcomes, and here are a few. We need to know that research uses two approaches when looking at how culture influences outcomes. Intercultural studies compare outcomes of the same simulation. Negotiators from different cultures negotiating with others from their own culture. And then cross cultural studies compare intracultural or cross cultural outcomes. Negotiating with people from the same culture, comparing outcomes to negotiation with people from other cultures. A simple intercultural buyer seller negotiation simulation was used with negotiators from several cultures. Findings show no difference in profit levels obtained by negotiators in different cultures like the US with Japan, China, Canada, Brazil, and Mexico. And negotiators in collectivist cultures are more likely to reach integrative outcomes than negotiators in individualistic cultures. There are some effects of culture on negotiation outcomes, and we'll talk about some of the things that the research shares. There are richer simulations identified with differences in outcomes by cultures, but likely due to differences in processes across cultures, the second approach compares intercultural and cross-cultural outcomes. Cross-cultural negotiations result in poorer outcomes, at least some of the time. In addition, some differences were found in the cross culture. Excuse me. It's talking about research talking about culture affects negotiation outcomes, though it may not be directly and may be due to differences in negotiation processes in different cultures. There is some evidence that cross cultural negotiation yields poorer outcomes than intercultural negotiations. Culture on negotiation process and the information exchange we're going to talk about right now. So one group of studies led to several conclusions. In American negotiations, higher profits were associated with making opponents feel comfortable, while in Japanese negotiations, higher profits were associated with making opponents feel comfortable. Brazilian negotiators using powerful deceptive strategies received higher outcomes than negotiation in America using the same methods. Gathering information was negatively related to profits attained by Mexican and French Canadian negotiators, while the same strategies were unrelated to profits among American negotiators. Chinese and US negotiators used different communication patterns. Chinese negotiators asked more questions, said no less often, and interrupted each other more frequently than Americans. There's some effects of culture on negotiation. And let's specifically talk about the process and information exchange and more research, of course. So, some additional findings were that collectivist negotiators focus on long term goals and make less extreme offers than individualistic negotiators. US negotiators were most likely to use direct information exchange, while Japanese negotiators used indirect exchange with information. And negotiators from culturally similar countries were more likely to share information than negotiators from less culturally similar countries. Both US and Japanese intercultural negotiation reached higher joint gains than cross cultural negotiations, but they achieved it differently. Low context cultures have negotiators using direct communication compared to indirect from negotiators in high context cultures. Aggressive opening offers give Hong Kong negotiators an advantage when using email to conduct negotiation. And German negotiators use more integrative tactics than Chinese negotiators when negotiating interculturally. All right, finally, let's talk about some effects of culture on negotiator cognition. Accountability to a constituent influence negotiators from individualistic and collectivistic cultures differently. Individualistic grew competitive, collectivistic became more cooperative. When comparing collectivist and individualist on the same conflict, con, uh, collectivists saw conflict as compromise, both used different frames. Chinese negotiators used more competitive tactics than Americans, but likely due to their view of the negotiation as a competitive situation. When researching cognitive effects of culture and negotiation, individualists were susceptible to fixed pi errors than collectivists. The self serving bias was stronger in individualistic than collectivist. Collectivists were less prone to make arbitration errors during negotiation than were individualistic negotiators. There are some effects of culture on the negotiator ethics and tactics that we're going to talk about. One study investigated perceptions of Lewicki and Robinson's negotiation tactics with negotiators from 6 different cultures. Japanese negotiators were more intolerant of misrepresentation. Brazilians and Americans scored similarly to Lewicki and Robinson's ethics questionnaire. Americans said they were more likely to use the tactics than Brazilians. From the SINS questionnaire, Chinese negotiators were more likely to use ethically questionable tactics than American negotiators. The use of interpretation of apologies may be influenced by culture. Individualists, uh, apologies assign blame, collectivistics express remorse. Collectivists were more likely to accept an apology in for an integrity violation than were the individualists. Culturally responsive negotiation strategies are interesting. Several factors suggest that negotiations should not make large modifications of their approach when negotiating cross culturally. First, negotiators may not be able to modify their approach effectively. Second, it does not mean that this will translate automatically into a better negotiation outcome. Moderate adaptation may be more effective. Moderate adaptation may be more effective than acting as the Romans do. Negotiators from a familiar culture making moderate adaptations to American ways were perceived more positively than negotiators making no changes or large adaptations. Negotiators should understand 3 things: their own biases, strengths, and weaknesses, the other negotiator and the individual, and the other negotiator's cultural context. Finally, here's some interesting facts about WACE's cultural responsive strategies. If there's low familiarity, it's wise to employ agents or advisors that have a unilateral strategy. Bring a mediator and create a joint strategy. Induce the other party to use your approach. That's a joint strategy. If there's moderate familiarity, adapt to the other party's approach in a unilateral strategy. Coordinate adjustment in a joint strategy. And finally, if there's high familiarity, embrace the negotiator's approach, unilateral strategy, improvise an approach to and have a joint strategy, or affect symphony and have a joint strategy. That was a 30-minute video, and I hope that you're taking some great insights with you. And more than anything else, I hope that you have a great day because only you get to choose how you feel about it. I'm Dr. Paul Gerhardt.